Now, let me turn my attention to the amendment that I alluded to, Mr. President, and that is an amendment to the FAA reauthorization bill. What Senator Casey and I are doing is we're going to introduce, as an amendment, the legislation that we've introduced as a freestanding bill, and that's the Saraceni Aviation Safety Act of 2016. I want to thank Senator Casey for the really good work that he has done on this issue for some time. Let me just give you a little bit of the background, Mr. President, on the amendment, which is based on the legislation that is named after Victor Saraceni. Victor Saraceni was a Bucks County, Pennsylvania native. He was a Navy pilot, and after he left the Navy, he became a commercial airline pilot. He was a captain, and he was a captain of United Flight 175, which, as you will recall, was one of the planes that was captured by terrorists on 9/11. Fact is, Captain Saraceni was murdered by the terrorists when they stormed the cockpit, took control of the plane, killed Victor Saraceni, and then flew the plane into the World Trade Center. Victor Saraceni left behind a wife, Ellen. She's with us today in the Senate. And she's been a very, very forceful and effective advocate for greater safety on board our commercial planes. And Victor left behind also two daughters, Kirsten and Brielle. What the amendment does is something very, very simple. It requires a secondary barrier to the cockpit on commercial aircraft. That's all. What that does is that would prevent unauthorized individuals from getting into the cockpit. Simple as that. It's a simple, lightweight, inexpensive technology, readily available. It's made actually from a wire mesh, and it provides a barrier between the passenger cabin and the cockpit door. It would only be engaged when the cockpit door is open. So why is this necessary? It's necessary because it is still entirely possible for terrorists to hijack commercial aircraft. Back in 2001, after 9/11, Congress took a step to make commercial aircraft cockpits more secure. They mandated the installation of reinforced doors. And these reinforced doors are much stronger than what doors used to exist. It's very, very difficult, almost impossible to breach those doors when they're closed. But the threat remains because on every long flight and many short flights, the doors are open. At some point during the course of the flight, pilots often get up and they get out of the cockpit. They have to go to the restroom, or they go to get some food, or a flight attendant goes in to check on the pilots or to bring them something that they want. And that moment when that door is open, that door is no longer a barrier. And therein lies the danger. There is the moment of opportunity for terrorists. Mr. President, the FAA fully acknowledges the serious nature of this risk. In April of 2015, an FAA advisory said the following, and I quote, "On long flights, as a matter of necessity, crew members must open the flight deck door to access lavatory facilities, to transfer meals to flight crew members, or to switch crew positions for crew rest purposes. The opening and closing of the flight deck door, referred to as door transition, reduces the protective, anti-intrusion, anti-penetration benefits of the reinforced door. During this door transition, the flight deck is vulnerable," end quote. Of course, it's not only the FAA that was able to figure this out. The terrorists understand this as well. The 9/11 Commission report said this, and I quote, "Khalid Sheikh Mohammed told them," and the them in this case refers to the terrorists he was instructing, "Khalid Sheikh Mohammed told them to watch the cabin doors at takeoff and landing, to observe whether the captain went to the lavatory during the flight, and to note whether the flight attendants brought food into the cockpit." I continue to quote, "The best time to storm the cockpit would be about 10 to 15 minutes after takeoff, when the cockpit doors typically were open for the first time." Further point made by the 9/11 Commission report, they had no firm contingency plan, this being this being the terrorists, had no firm contingency plan in case the cockpit door was locked. They were confident the cockpit doors would be opened and did not consider breaking them down a viable idea. Now, since then, we've made the doors even more durable. It would be even more difficult to actually destroy the door or break down the door or otherwise open a closed door. The problem is when the door is open. And this is not just a theoretical risk, Mr. President. Since 9/11, there have been at least 51 attempts at cockpit breaches worldwide. 5 attempts have been successful. One successful attempt occurred in 2006 on Turkish Airlines Flight 1476. Terrorists were successful in entering the cockpit after a flight attendant opened the door to ask the pilots if they needed anything. So it seems to me unacceptable when we have a readily available solution to continue to take this risk. It's just common sense to install secondary barriers on commercial planes. These are inexpensive, several $1,000s to install. They are lightweight, they are easy to use, they are very compact when they're not engaged. And the only people who would really be inconvenienced by these secondary barriers would be terrorists. Had the secondary barriers, these kinds of barriers, been installed on 9/11, it would have made the job very, very difficult for the terrorists to ever get in to the cockpit. So, Mr. President, I want to urge my colleagues to support this amendment. I think this is a sensible amendment. The substance of this has been approved in the House. We ought to pass it here on the Senate floor and pass this FAA reauthorization underlying bill. And if we do that, in time, our skies will be that much safer. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor.